Hi boys and girls, it's time to read some more of our book Flat Stanley by Mr. Jeff Brown. I've enjoyed the book so far. It's kind of crazy, isn't it? Let's see what happens today. Stanley the Kite, Chapter 3. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park, but it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him a little mad. One Saturday afternoon in the street, they met Mrs. Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop. "Well, George, I see you have bought some wallpaper," Mr. Jones said. "Going to decorate your house, I suppose?" "Wallpaper," said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh, no, this is my son, Stanley." He undid the string and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young feller," the man said. "George," he said to Mr. Lambchop, "that boy's flat." "Smart, too," Mr. Lambchop said. "Stanley is third from top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my younger son, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said, "and he will apologize for his rudeness." Arthur could only blush and apologize. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard when they were on the way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the encyclopedia on top of himself. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when they saw him. "Just don't stand there. Help me." What do you think Arthur's doing? Do you think he wants to be flat too? Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke to Stanley. "Arthur can't help being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother after all." The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails made in all the colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I'll have a big kite, and I will win a kite flying contest and be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days." Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. "You can fly me, Arthur," Stanley said. "Come on." He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. Up, 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 up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on the gusts of the wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him from behind when he wanted to speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind carefully, a little at the time, so that it did not hold him, and then he would slip gracefully down toward the earth again. Arthur let out all of the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left in long match swoops. He held his arms by his side and zoomed like an airplane at the ground, or like a rocket, and curved up again toward the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. No one has ever flown the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day. Probably no one ever will again. And after a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur grew tired of running. Look at Stanley flying in the sky. And down here you see Arthur and all the people watching him. Kind of looks like fun. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He did not notice while he was eating the hot dog that the wind was blowing the string and tangling it around the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley didn't realize how low he was until leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. Stanley got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries, "Help!" and climbed up to get him free. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still cross. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. "You're at the office all day, having fun," she said. "You don't realize what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult." "Kids are like that," Mr. Lambchop said. "Just phases. Be patient, dear." Chapter 4. Mr. and Mrs. O.J. Dart lived in the apartment above the Lambchops. Mr. Dart was an important man, the director of the famous Museum of Art downtown in the city. Stanley Lambchop had noticed in the elevator that Mr. Dart, who was ordinarily a cheerful man, had become quite gloomy, but he had no idea what the reason was. There's Stanley in the elevator with Mr. Dart. And then at breakfast one morning, he heard Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop talking about Mr. Dart. "I see," said Mr. Lambchop, reading the paper over his coffee cup. "That's still another painting that's been stolen from the famous museum. It says here that Mr. O.J. Dart, the director, is at his wit's end. That means he's thought about this a lot and he does not know what to do." "Oh dear, are the police no help?" Mrs. Lambchop asked. "It seems not," said Mr. Lambchop. "Listen to what the chief of police told the newspaper. We suspect a gang of sneak thieves. These are the worst kind. They work by sneakery, which makes them very difficult to catch. However, my men and I will keep trying. Meanwhile, I hope people will buy tickets for the policeman ball and not park their cars where signs say don't." The next morning, Stanley Lambchop heard Mr. Dart talking to his wife in the elevator. "These sneak thieves work at night," Mr. Dart said. "It is very hard for our guards to stay awake when they have been on duty all day. And the famous museum is so big we cannot guard every picture at the same time. I fear it is hopeless, hopeless, hopeless." Suddenly, as if an electric light bulb had lit up in the air above his head, giving out little shooting signs of excitement, Stanley Lambchop had an idea. He told it to Mr. Dart. "Stanley," Mr. Dart said, "if your mother will give her permission, I will put you and your plan to work this very minute." Mrs. Lambchop gave her permission. "But you will have to take a long nap this afternoon," she said. "I won't have you up till all hours unless you do so." That evening, after a long nap, Stanley went with Mr. Dart to the famous museum. Mr. Dart took him into the main hall, where the biggest and most important paintings were hung. He pointed to a huge painting that showed a bearded man wearing a floppy velvet hat playing a violin for a lady who lay on a couch. There was a half-man, half-horse person standing behind them, and 3 fat children with wings were flying around above. That, Mr. Dart explained, was the most expensive painting in the world. There was an empty picture frame on the opposite wall. We shall hear more about that later on. Mr. Dart took Stanley into his office and said, "It's time for you to put on a disguise." "I already thought of that," Stanley Lambchop said, "and I brought one, my cowboy suit. It has a red bandana that I can tie around my face. No one will recognize me in a million years." "No," Mr. Dart said, "you will have to wear the disguise I have chosen." From a closet, he took a white dress with a blue sash. A dress. And a pair of shiny little pointed shoes. A wide straw hat with a blue band that matched the sash, and a wig and a stick. The wig was made of blonde hair, long and done in ringlets. The stick was curved at the top, and it too had a blue ribbon on it. "In this shepherdess disguise," Mr. Dart said, "you will look like a painting that belongs in the main hall. We do not have cowboy pictures in the main hall." So Mr. Dart wanted Stanley to look like a painting. Stanley was so disgusted he could hardly speak. I will look like a girl. That's what I will look like. I wish I had never had my idea. But he was a good sport, so he put on the disguise. Back in the main hall, Mr. Dart helped Stanley climb up to the empty picture frame. Stanley was able to stay in place because Mr. Dart had cleverly put 4 small spikes in the wall, one for each hand and foot to hang on. The frame was a perfect fit against the wall. Stanley looked just like a picture. Except for one thing, Mr. Dart said. Shepherdesses are supposed to look happy. They smile at their sheep and at the sky. You look fierce, not happy, Stanley. Stanley tried hard to get a faraway look in his eyes and even to smile a little bit. Mr. Dart stood back a few minutes and stared at him for a moment. Well, he said, it may not be art, but I know what I like. He went off to make sure that certain other parts of Stanley's plan were taken care of, and Stanley was left alone. Well, boys and girls, there's more to go for this chapter, but we're going to wait till next time to find out what happens to Stanley and to the museum. So what I'd like you to do is think of some ideas. What do you think Stanley's plan was? Well, we'll find out next time.